I thought I would spend the time this morning telling you my story, because it is always, behind every fiction writer's fiction is her own life, and it is that life that informs the choices she makes as a storyteller. And I did, in fact, grow up in a family of secrets. My parents were dazzling, brilliant, I was going to say devastatingly articulate people, and I think that word is correct because they could slash you up one side and down the other. They were people who loved language, whose religion was language, and you could have had a transcript of dinner table conversation at our household, and it would have been a pretty good reading. But in all the conversations about art and music and politics and religion and sex even, there remained one topic that was never mentioned in our home, and that was the fact that every night my father got drunk, and every morning we pretended it never happened. And so I will add another element that I think is a theme of my books, and that is shame. Shame sometimes not for the things of our own doing, but for the secrets of others that we feel an obligation to protect. And I lived with this kind of double life. There was the picture that we presented to the world of who we were. And incidentally, that was very much the picture that I presented in that first article, the irony of whose title I totally missed, An 18-Year-Old Looks Back on Life. That was me, the good girl, the youth spokesperson of 1972, giving the official version of my growing up, in which a few key elements were notably lacking. Not only the fact of my father's drinking. I actually thought that I was the only person in the world whose father got drunk. And that's one of the things that happens when you keep secrets. You don't know that everybody else also has those secrets. So you're isolated and alone and ashamed. I did not include in my original story in the New York Times the fact that at the time I was writing that story, I was suffering from pretty profound eating disorders. The word anorexia was really not known in 1972. Or that I had struggles with my mother, struggles with my sister. And I'm not seeing anybody fleeing this room in horror as I say these things, because one of the many differences between me at 18, when I was so shameful and so fearful of somebody finding out my secret, and me at 61, is that I now know, and it's actually publishing my work and sharing my secrets over the years that has confirmed this and emboldened me to tell them and to talk about them and to shine a light on them. I know that everybody has those shameful secrets. And the more we bring them out into the light, the less shameful they become because we share them. So I mentioned that my parents were these brilliant people and hugely gifted, but hugely frustrated in their own artistic lives. My father was a painter whose artwork never was shown and never seen. And my mother was the daughter of Russian immigrant Jews who had scrabbled her way to be the first person ever in her family to go to college and then graduate school. She got herself to Harvard. It was Radcliffe in those days. Graduated summa cum laude, and like so many women of her generation, and that's the generation of so many of our mothers, she could not get a job. She was a wife and mother of the 50s. So my Harvard PhD mother sold encyclopedias door to door and tutored Latin for $1 an hour. And eventually wrote. She wrote for the baby magazines. She became the secret ghostwriter, secret, of Dr. Joyce Brothers. It's not why I got my name. But like so many of the daughters of those mothers, I became her little emissary out into the world. And I cannot remember a time when I was so young that I did not know that it was my job to earn the acknowledgement and success that had been denied to her. So I started writing with a vengeance, and I use those words with thought, because it was my job to lay my success at my mother's feet. Teresa mentioned 17 magazine. In fact, my first publication was in Humpty Dumpty. Some of you are old enough to remember it. And when I got myself to college, I did, in fact, take my clippings, a group of my clippings. I was a shy girl. I couldn't even speak to a boy. I had never had a relationship with a boy. But I took a bunch of my clippings from 17 magazine, mailed them off to the editor-in-chief of the New York Times and said, I'd like to write for you. And interestingly, he wrote back and said, okay, and gave me the only assignment that I was equipped to fulfill in any sort of way, which was to write about my growing up in the 60s. That article was published in the spring of what turned out to be my one and only year of college. I stand before you as a dropout, and there's a lot of regret about that. And within 2 days of the publication of that story, there were 2 enormous sacks of mail delivered to my Yale dormitory room, filled with all the kinds of offers and opportunities that a girl from a very small town in New Hampshire, whose mother had dreamed of a career and hadn't gotten one, and wanted her daughter to publish books and get to New York City and get to places like Pasadena. And I kid you not, Hollywood was the dream. Los Angeles was the dream. I knew it only from television. Every one of those kinds of offers was suddenly laid before me. And there were editors calling to invite me to have, writing to invite me to have lunch with them in the Palm Court of the Plaza Hotel, and radio people and TV people and movie producers. I was actually invited to audition for The Exorcist. Obviously, didn't get that part. And it was a pretty heady experience for an 18-year-old girl. But in among those letters was one very different one from all the rest. It was a typewritten, single-spaced on very thin paper. And I recognized right away as I started to read it that this was a different kind of a voice. And the writer began by saying, I read your article in the paper 2 days ago, and I could tell that you were a real writer. And I wanted to say that I want to be your friend and your supporter. He used a word, it's a very powerful word if you know Yiddish, Landsman. We were Landsman. It means you come from the same village in the old country. And I didn't think anybody came from my village. I was alone in the world. But suddenly there was this person saying, me too. Come with me. And I will say that the experience that I had reading that letter is not unlike the experience that now many, many millions of people, particularly young people, have had reading the words of that writer, who spoke in a very particular way to lonely, isolated, alienated feeling young people. And long before I got to the signature, I felt this is the one person on the face of the earth who knows and understands me. Here at last is my true friend and mentor. And the signature, it didn't really matter what the signature was. I would have felt that way anyway. But the signature belonged to J.D. Salinger, who, even in 1972, I'm sort of surprised that I still hear people respond, because I thought everybody knew that about me. It's the sort of the horrifying truth of my life as a writer for 42 years, author of 15 books, mother of 3 children, that if you Google my name, that's what comes up. And here I am talking about it. But in fact, it has become indelibly a part of my story. We do not choose our stories. Our stories, we choose what we do with them, but our stories happen to us. Within days, I of course wrote back, and within days, the whole rest of everything that used to matter to me, my Yale education, my career, my meetings with editors, the book contract that I had signed to write a memoir fast before I got to be too old, disappeared, and I lived for the hour of the day when the mail was delivered to the Yale post office, and I would get my letter from Salinger. And when school got out, the first thing I did was to get myself to the mountain in New Hampshire where the man that I now regarded as the possessor of all wisdom, knowledge, and insight into the human condition and me resided. And I saw him as my friend, my mentor and friend. He was 53 years old. I was 18. But within weeks of meeting Jerry Salinger, I had left college, given up my full scholarship at Yale, given up my job at the New York Times, severed connections with just about everybody in my life, and moved in with Salinger, believing, as only an 18-year-old girl can, that I would be with this man forever, and that there was no better or safer place for me to be, and that my job was pleasing him. So, for instance, when he expressed deep contempt over the fact that I was writing a book, I felt shame over the fact that I was writing a book, the thing I'd worked so hard for all my life. From the moment I moved in, I ceased to be the perfect girl that I had been for him. He said to me the day I moved in, "You're behaving like a teenager." That's a hard one to do anything about when you're 18. 11 months later, and 3 weeks before the publication of my first book, Looking Back, a book that still neglected to tell many crucial elements of my story, including the fact that it was written in the home of Salinger. I think if that book had been 3 more pages than it's 160, I still wouldn't have told that story, because that was a forbidden story. I was not allowed to tell anybody where I was. 3 weeks before the publication of that book, on a trip to Florida with Jerry and his 2 children, one of whom was just a year younger than I, he put 2 $50 bills in my hand and said, you need to get out of my life, get out of here, go back, clear your things out of the house, and be gone before the children and I return. And the things that he said, if a man today said to me the kinds of things about who I was and who I was as a human being and as a writer, I would certainly think less of the man. But we've all been 18-year-old girls in this room, or 18-year-old boys, and I thought less of myself. So I did disappear. I did not go back to Yale. I did not fulfill my dream then of going to New York. Much later, I got myself to New York City. And I went back believing in his assessment of me, and believing, too, that it was my obligation to keep the secret of who he had been in my life. Not a week went by for 25 years. I'm now going to jump very fast over a lot of time. And you can read the longer version in At Home in the World. Not a week went by, usually not a day, that I wouldn't be asked about him, but I felt it was my obligation to say absolutely nothing about him. And I maintained that position, writing, mind you, writing articles and essays and eventually books, and work that I can look back on now and feel proud of, but with one crucial omission, and that was the omission of that crucial year in my life. I know what changed. My daughter, my oldest child, turned 18, the age that I was when everything changed. And when I was 44, I gave myself, I revisited that experience, the big, shameful secret of my failure to please the great and important man, so much more important than I. Tell your story. And I stand before you as a person who knows very well how impossible it was to make sense of my life with one crucial piece missing, and how freeing it is. I just came back from Guatemala. Every year I host a group of 18 women at my home on the shores of Lake Atitlan, Guatemala. Most of them are not professional writers, but we have one mission, which is we sit for a week in that very far away sort of magical place, and they write their stories. And, you know, I have always said, I wish I could take before and after pictures of how they look the day they get off the boat and land in my garden, and how they look 8 days later when they get back on the boat and sail away. There's one difference. Sometimes there's a few. They've purchased some woven bags and some cool necklaces. But really the difference is they've told the truth. And the truth will set you free. Thank you so much, and I look forward to talking with you.